I'm Linda Pavinetti, and I'm very pleased to be here. I was thrilled when Doris asked me to introduce this panel. A couple of years ago, I was serving on IFLA's board, or IFLA's committees, as a representative of ALSC, ALA's Services for Children. And one of the privileges I had was to tour the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg. And I have never had such a thrilling experience in my entire life. And I have been fascinated with Eastern Europe and all of the beautiful, beautiful images that they present to us and the books that they create. There was a special exhibit of their children's books in the library, and it was just absolutely thrilling to be there and to be able to see that. So I am so excited today for you to possibly get a peek into some of the materials that they can produce and our authors and illustrators will tell us about. First of all, Junko does not look like she is from Eastern Europe, and she is not, but she is taking the place of one of the speakers who was not able to come in from Poland, Dorota from the Michuka from the University of Wrocław, and I'm still not saying it right, I'm sure, but my Polish husband corrects me every time I try to say it. Junko had the privilege of being there just quite recently on a Fulbright Fellowship and was teaching at the university and got to know Dorota and got to know some of the Polish literature, so she has graciously accepted the invitation to step in and take her place. So thank you, Junko, for doing that. The gentleman, the one that we can easily tell who's who, is Rob Braievsky. I think I might have said that close anyway. But Rob holds a BFA in Graphic Arts from Moscow Polygraphic Institute and a BFA in Illustration from the Parsons School of Design. His first children's book was published in 1985, and since then he has illustrated 23 more children's books. We are very fortunate to have him here. He's done Hey You, Poems to Skyscrapers, Paul Janesco, Antonyms, Synonyms, and Homonyms by Kim Raevsky, and Under New York by Linda Oatman High. He's won numerous awards, including the Gold Award in Children's Market category from the Society of Illustrators in Los Angeles. Thank you very much, Rob, for being here today. Our other presenter, in between Junko and Rob, is Sibylla, and I'm going to try this, and I hope I'm close.
Don't worry about it.
Sheskrjiska from Bulgaria. And Sylvia is a paper conservator at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania. She has been collecting Bulgarian children's books for over 20 years. So she's going to be talking about the kinds of books that are produced in Bulgaria, and we're very pleased to have her here. Her private collection of children's books is over 5,000 copies from Bulgaria. Welcome.
Thank you.
And our moderator is Olga Bukina, who is also a native Russian, and Olga is a translator of children's books, especially historical fiction and nonfiction. She writes children's books, and she writes about children's books. She's translated over 20 books from English into Russian, and most recently, Breaking Stalin's Nose by Eugene Yelchin, which I'd love to be a fly on the wall and hear what people say about that. And The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate by Jacqueline Kelly, which we realized is the bestseller in Russia right now. And all of us are just shaking our head and wondering how that happened. She has recently co-authored 3 children's books and has written literary reviews in many, many journals and websites and so forth. She's going to be the moderator, and I will be keeping time. So thank you all very much for your attention, and we hope you enjoy our panel.
Thank you. I will start from explaining kind of what you will see. It will be rotating over and over again, and it's books from 3 countries. We collected various books of the past and the present, just for you to, they will not be kind of immediately related to what we're talking about because it's difficult to coordinate, but just to give you a taste and a look how it's, what is about, what's going on in three countries we will be talking about: Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia. And I provided a map just in case you remind you where we are. Because in many places, I know not in this place, but in many places you need to remind where the Eastern Europe and all other countries are. And I want to start from the acknowledgement that it's very, very difficult to be on the stage after two previous presenters, and I was moved and touched with their stories, but we will try our best. And if you remember, yesterday we had a translation session, and consider this a translation session number 2, because most of these books are not translated into English, but they should be. And I hope one day they will be, the same way like The Giver was recently translated into Russian, and I'm sure to Bulgarian and to Polish. And now I want us to talk about a little bit about past, how that children's literature developed in that region, and a lot about present, what's going on right now in our countries, and a little bit about how the past affects the future and the present, and what changes we see right now. And we will start from Bulgaria in alphabetical order. And I will ask Sibila to start talking about, in the first round of our conversation, about picture books in Bulgaria, and you will see them in a minute. The Bulgaria will come on the screen, and you will see them again and again.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having a representative from my country here. I actually want to go back just to say two big thank yous. One to Leonard, because you can never go wrong thanking Leonard.
Here.
And the other one is, I didn't realize this morning that Chris Rushka will be here. I knew he will be around, so I was schlepping my books, some of them that I own of his from Philadelphia. And I want to tell you that this book, my son, who is 7, reads over and over again, and he goes, "This book is hilarious." He just loves it. He twists it, he gets all of it. And this book is why I'm so happy that my kids are actually growing up in the States, in a diverse society. So your work means the world to me. Thank you. How do I put myself together? The books that were published, so my collection, I'm not speaking as a scholar, I'm just collecting books, and I came to realize why I'm doing that. I'm kind of trying to recreate my childhood and to surround myself with the things that I loved and make my comfort zone. I actually have a comforter zone idea. You can take it, sell it, just credit my name. To actually print the covers of the book that I love so much on a big blanket and wrap myself in it. Because they really, whenever coming here in the States and, dealing with the new language, with the new culture, the books were the things that I will go and cuddle, like Carlson by Astrid Lindgren, all the things that were translated. A lot of literature actually was translated into Bulgarian during the communist regime, and great exposure to nations around us, a lot of Russian literature. I went to a Russian school for my first 7 years, Russian language only school. So a lot of the things that you guys will be talking about, they also will make it into that blanket. But yeah, so some of it was traditional illustration-wise. I started collecting things that spoke to my childhood, what I had at home. And then I decided that I need to get more things because they represent political things. They are, a lot of them clearly issued by the government, so they weren't very pretty, they weren't written well, but they were a historical artifact to me. So I decided to start adding these as well. So now the collection, it's actually 5,000 copies, maybe English titles in Bulgarian and Russian. The Bulgarian titles are about 2,000, I think. Yeah.
Okay, and I would love to Junka to chip in, and I want to thank you her for stepping in like big shoes because
I have
it's
to tell
difficult.
you, Dorota knows this much about Polish children's literature, and I know this much. And by the end of today's talk, you'll know everything I know about Polish children's literature. But in terms of the historical, the little bits I know include the idea that there's a heavy influence from illustration styles that were very beautiful, like paintings inside of books. So you would see a lot of text, very heavy text, even in the picture books for children, and then suddenly sort of show-stopping, wall-hanging, museum-worthy art that would stop you so that you really studied what was there as art. When I ask my students what were the children's literature that they remember fondly from their childhood, their youth would first show when they would say, oh, Donald Duck. And I say, no, really, what is your children's literature? Without doubt, my students would start reciting from Tuwim's poem, Lokomotiva, which seemed to be something that was near and dear to their hearts, something everyone could recite. The local librarian in my library selected 16 different volumes that included Lokomotiva, showed me different illustration styles, including an app that portrayed this poem. But Tuwim's other poem that I studied quite a bit while I was there is called Bambo, and it's a depiction of a black child in ways that I found to be particularly curious that it continues to be published today. So this is everything I know about the history of children's literature in Poland. I'm sorry to say, in picture books.
And now we will go a little bit to history of children's literature in Russia and personal experience inside that children's literature.
Well,
To
thank you, Olga, for inviting me here. And actually, I must say that this bright light
It's
in
really
your eyes
blinding, isn't it?
remind me of good old days of KGB interrogation. And of course we'll
Thank
be,
you.
of course we'll be speaking Russian now. Well, I must say that what I'm going to say I might end up in the enemy list of Homeland Security, because I must say that the Russian Revolution unleashed amazing creative forces in the 1920s, and I'm not a communist, but revolution brought tremendous suffering to Russia, and deaths and hardship of ordinary people. But 1920s were also the time when suddenly it was just absolutely amazing creative, the revolution of the arts also. And that was no boundaries, and that situation continued till early 30s when the regime turned, arts become ideological and part of the government, controlled by the government. But in 1920s, the amazing artists were working for graphic design, illustration, and filmmakers, and there is a wonderful exhibition right now in the Jewish Museum about early Soviet cinema and posters. I would highly recommend it for everybody. You can see what was going on in Russia in 1920s. And a lot of these wonderful artists were working in children's books because, again, the revolution brought this idea of education for everybody. And so the children literature become extremely important for the government who sponsored that. And the early books of Lebedev, who was a fantastic graphic designer and artist, and he basically created the art unmatchable since that time. And so, as I said, that everything ended in the beginning of the 30s, and for many years, that was still a lot of wonderful artists continued to work on children's literature, but under total control, and even Lebedev's latest work was shameful. because everybody were afraid, to do anything different. You might end up in Gulag. But then in the 60s, when things started to change, then some influence from the West started to appear. And I remember actually as a student in Moscow Polygraphic Institute in the beginning of the 70s, how much we were influenced by Polish illustration and design. Absolutely fantastic posters were done in Poland back in the 60s and 70s, and we didn't really have an access to what was going on in the West, but at least we could have an access to the art scene in Eastern European countries, and the Polish design and illustration we were very much influenced by that. And so in 60s and 70s, a lot of very interesting artists and writers were working for children because it was an outlet. It was the least ideological part of the art world where one could actually do creative work. So that was kind of, the control of the government was a bad thing, of course, but it created this amazing group of people working for children's literature to escape that control. And that was, I remember back in my art school, I had fantastic teachers, young, some of them illustrators, some of them artists, and some of them were working for children's book illustration. So that was another outlet to teach art for the kids. And I remember one day, they all just, a bunch of them just disappeared in 1968, I believe. And it turns out that they all signed letters for defending two Russian writers, Daniel and Sinyavsky, who were arrested by the government because their work was published in the West. And all these teachers disappeared, came to school one day, they were there, and the next day they weren't. So they were all fired. So, but as I said, that was an outlet for creative people. So we were growing up with these amazing books done by amazing people. So I guess it's, in few words, kind of shows the atmosphere of those days.
And now we will try to jump sort of big period of time and talk a little bit about what's going on now in those countries. And again, let's start from Bulgaria and what's going on now, what kind of artists, what kind of writers are active now.
So I knew that I was gonna come here and speak. So every summer we go home with my family to Bulgaria. So all of my friends do art. This is a criteria how you become my friend. So I actually was lucky to take interviews with the publishers, illustrators, writers, and translators, because I really appreciate the role of the translator into this business. I married one. When I gathered this collection of books, I came back home. I mean, half of the collection is here because it's very difficult to bring it back from Bulgaria. And I started putting them in different order and organizing them. And I work in the library. I should know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. I don't have the space for them anymore. My husband is, throwing papers for divorce with these books. So I started thinking, how do they go? Maybe I should do this by year, how they were published and what are the changes, because when you have this body of books, you really can see the change. And the thing that struck me was that after the fall of the communist regime, I'm not going to talk politics, things went downhill because nobody sponsored anything anymore. So we kind of had to realize in the real world how to do these things properly. And they went downhill translation-wise. Nobody was editing anything. You can read things that sounded in, I don't know what language, not Bulgarian. The illustrations were terrible. They were covers of sexy girls, for Pippi Longstockings. It was madness. I had examples which first I was going to share with you, then I thought that visually you'll get blind. And then now, finally, I think 7 years ago, things started picking up. There was, I guess, my kind of generation, age-wise, because these were people who already have children. All of them actually complained to me. They said, I said, what started you the publishing business? Because there is no money there. You kind of maybe break even if you sell your last copy. And they told me, we couldn't find a decent book for our children. They are either toys with things and strings and bells, but we want to read the text. The text is terribly translated, or it's written terribly. The illustrations are phew. So they wanted to control this, and they started making their own books. So last night I was thinking, oh my God, I'm here on this stage. I'll be so afraid, have stage fright. So please imagine behind me all my friends from Bulgaria that are working and producing these books and just want to share their work with you. And one of the first slides with the big tree, this is Kapka Kaneva. She's a very young illustrator. She does book covers, very talented girl. It's another book this is the only one that I actually chose to bring here because it's actually in black and white, and that's very risky to do anywhere, and that's crazy risky to do in Bulgaria. Where is the market for a black and white book with very few words? But they did a beautiful job.
On this note, it's very interesting how exactly the same process happened in Russia. In the early 90s was a kind of wild capitalism and wild market, and it was horrible translations again, and some very good translations too, because we tried from the very beginning. But last, I would say 7 to 10 years, that's like a revolution. And a lot of people in Russia still don't notice it, because we're still drowning in it. It's a huge country. There's huge production of old books and bad translations and bad, popular books from the West. But more and more there's this small publishing houses, which are the same way people wanted books for their children. And it's mostly mothers whose, husbands are businessmen and can support them, and they start this little publishing houses. We call them boutique publishing houses, and they start producing translations and original work from Russia. But even translations mostly were done with local illustrations last 10 years, which open up enormous possibilities for young people, young illustrators. And you will see some of them, and I always put the illustrator name on for the book to acknowledge the illustrators. But also the emerging literature, Russian literature for young people is still very little, kind of. What picture book is still not very much. I see it much more in Bulgaria. In Russia, it's still more old picture books. But what's happened, young readers' literature just jump-started. But I will talk about it a little bit later, because I will let Junka to talk about picture books in Poland first.
So the primary area of research I was doing in Poland was on picture books. And this was a follow-up to some work I had done early on visual narratives and picture books in Germany. And what was interesting for me is that in Germany, much like in the United States and in Japan, the picture books that I was coming across they had a very strong sense of how the story was told without knowing the language even, but very much where the illustrations would allow you to understand the characterizations, the setting, the plot, and all of that unfolding. However, in Poland, that wasn't necessarily the case. I often would come across beautiful books that were well designed, meticulously, beautifully illustrated, and yet I constantly had to ask for help because the illustrations themselves didn't carry a narrative. Not necessarily in every case, but in many cases. And that was the power of the text that was necessary to understand the whole. I studied the work of people we've long known, such as Josef Wilkon's work, which has been published here in the United States as well as around the world. And he today, in his late 80s, continues to publish beautiful works of art. in Poland, one of his newer transitions has been to go from doing a lot of watercolor work to now doing more sculpting, which he has done before, but now the sculptures have become integrated into telling stories through his picture books. I think you saw one of his photographs and slides coming up through here earlier. I also spent a lot of time studying the work of Iwona Chmielewska, who is well known, particularly in Korea and also in Japan, becoming increasingly popular in Poland, but her work was first recognized by many publishers in Korea as having the ability to say a lot, but without using a lot of literal illustration or text. Iwona's work is such that she is more metaphoric. She alludes to things through her illustrations that are thoughtful, and it's up to the reader to figure out what in fact is being implied through much of her work. Again, I have her book, Blumka's Diary, shown up here on the screen. I also studied the work of Marta Ignerska, and here I'd like to lead into the work that scholar and Professor Anita Vincenzes-Patina put together, the slide that showed you beautiful lives on beautiful pages or something like that. She did a wonderful presentation in Gdansk and generously shared her work with me, but she really studied the idea that biographies of Polish people have really taken a new turn. And so to get the young people today interested in the lives of Polish famous people, they have used a real sense of design in conveying how they portray the lives. So even though they might be philosophers and people you see as being, you can see the profile it being very traditionally old-fashioned 1800s kind of illustration, and then all of a sudden you see these neon green eyes that make you want to know who is this philosopher in fact, or Bill and I were quite entertained by the biography of a Polish bear that was in the military and served quite a few roles in everything from helping move ammunition around to providing entertainment for the troops and all of that. But so I think this role of this biography series has been particularly important. Marta Ignerska is the one who illustrated the book in which it was black as a background and had very yellow illustrations. And I sent this to David Wiesner once, and he said, that is not an American picture book. And I said, you're right. But it won the Polish Best Illustrated Book of the Year award. And so starting to understand the role of design, even on the text pages, as being very dynamic in how the information is portrayed has been important in studying Marta's work. I also looked at the work of Daniel Myślensky, and perhaps he is best known for being the first creator of wordless books in Poland, and his book series Mamoko have also been published here in the United States as well as in many other countries. It's sort of a science fiction look at Where's Waldo type of book where you're trying to figure out where the characters and the stories are, but perhaps he is most well known around the world for his book Maps. I think in every country I've been in recently, the book Maps has been absolutely everywhere. Something to be admired for the giant task that he took on of creating maps of the world. I think that same book also leads me to start thinking about the idea of diversity, which has been a part of what I have looked at in Poland. Diversity in Poland in these days is fairly small. I was the Asian. People would actually say that about me. Here's the Asian. Yes, that was me. But diversity is something that this current generation hasn't thought a lot about. And so in the book, the Maps, for example, the page on Japan had to be re-illustrated for it to be published in Japan. China embraced it and even made maps of it in Chinese, putting the word out there. And they said, oh, yes, they're caricatures, but it's okay. They don't know us. That's them. The Polish people portrayed us like this, and it's a great book, and they included us. I think that this is the area in which I see not yet inroads made into how the literature has been done. The area in which Polish literature has grown significantly and has become has long been very important in the lives of many readers has been that of young readers, as you had mentioned, the teenagers, and that's fantasy. The research in fantasy literature out of Poland is completely amazing. And the research that has been done, not only of Polish fantasy books, but also of fantasy books from around the world, and published in both Polish as well as in English, entire books analyzing and looking at the readership of Polish fantasy.
Thank you so much. And again, on that note, I would bring us back to Russia for a moment. But before that, I want Rob to share a little bit of his story, because this panel is kind of bridges between past and present, bridges between different countries. And Rob himself is sort of a bridge between Russia and America in his own story. And a couple of minutes about your personal story.
Sure, yes. I just first I would like to add to what you just said about the development of children's books in Russia and Eastern European countries in the 90s. So that was a total chaos, of course, and nothing was published, and there was no money. The same situation was in Russia too, and the most interesting writers and artists were actually published from Eastern Europe and Russia were actually published here in the United States. And I have to mention the North-South publication that Mark Cheshire was an editor there, and they brought amazing variety of artists from Eastern Europe. And the best from Russia actually also were published here. Some immigrated, some were just working there. And now this situation definitely changes for better. Definitely in Eastern Europe, in Russia, it's a little tricky, but still, even with what's going on in Russia politically, there is always amazing creative force there. The people, the artists kind of live in their own world, which is like a Vatican. It's like a little small world inside of the actually totally different foreign country. And well, about my experience, yes, I must agree. I am kind of a bridge between two different worlds. When I immigrated in 1978, it was still good old Soviet Union. And when I immigrated, I thought it would be that's it forever, because you actually had to give up your citizenship and pay for it. I paid 500 rubles to give up my citizenship and the passport, which was an equivalent of 5 months' salary of an engineer. So, I did study it in Moscow Polygraphic Institute, which was very prestigious school for graphic artists and designers, and actually that was no division between graphic arts and illustration. It was one subject, and actually when I came here and started working here, I was quite surprised that I was asked to provide illustrations only, and somebody would do design, because that's not the way I was taught. And for a while, I actually, accepted as a given, but eventually tried to and did design my latest books myself, and I think that actually was the right approach, because you see the book as a whole, not just as parts of it. Like Chris Rushke's quote was here on the screen about book being as a whole, not just parts of it. And when you do illustration, somebody designed it. It's like you are getting dressed up. You choose a tie, a suit, and then somebody puts, some different accessories on you, which don't belong to that particular outfit. So that was the main difference. But of course, then when I was studying at Parsons School of Design here, and the reason I went there because I simply didn't know anything about illustration field at all. I didn't know what portfolio was. When somebody mentioned portfolio, I didn't know what it was. So I was working first in a factory, then driving cab in New York City. So eventually I just decided I need to go back to school to see what's going on. And the Parsons School of Design was a fantastic school. I enjoyed it. Totally different atmosphere from the Moscow Polygraphic Institute, the kind of creative freedom, which we certainly didn't have back in the 70s in Moscow, even though we received very good kind of education in crafts. We all were required to do typing, to write typing, and to do everything by hand. So it was very, very good education back in Moscow. But here in Parsons School of Design, it was completely different atmosphere of creative freedom. You kind of do whatever you want. Like back in Moscow, once if you're studying with the teacher, so you basically required to be a little clone of the teacher to follow his or her steps. And here it didn't exist at all. So I'm glad that I went to Parsons and experienced this completely different atmosphere. And that's actually where I decided to become children's book illustrator. That one of my teachers was Andrzej Dudzinski, a Polish illustrator, fantastic illustrator, and he actually looked at my work and said, "Rob, you really should do children's book." And I said, "Oh, interesting." So that's how it all starts. So I don't know if you have any particular questions about the bridge.
I would love you to mention a couple of your books.
Oh, okay. Well, the very first one was Hichiti Hachiti Up I Go back in 1985, and that was three-color separation art. So I'm that old. I don't know if you remember that. All this piles of different colors with registration marks put together, sandwiched together to be reproduced. Then Aesop's series of Aesop's fables with Tom Paxton, and Under New York is also one of my favorite.
Thank you. And again, let's jump to the present. And you mentioned sort of how politics always affect Russian children's literature and Russian art for children's literature. We had wonderful years in Russia, sort of few wonderful years, which is a very rare case for Russia, trust me. But last 3-4 years, kind of somehow government remembered that children's literature is an important thing. For a while, government forgot about us, and we were very happy. And now we still have not full kind of censorship, but some kind of control. We need to mark books, what age they, like movies here, like what's appropriate for what age. It's right on the cover, which kind of defeat the purpose very often. But nevertheless, people try to write and people try to publish. And what's interesting right now in Russia, and I think it's also in Poland, and you will maybe add about Bulgaria in a minute, writers start writing about difficult issues, because Soviet children's literature was always super optimistic. If the character dies, it's only a war hero, or he saves his Communist Party, or whatever he does. In a contemporary Russian book, there's life. There's life and death, death of a parent, orphan children, father who is in prison, even gay issues, which is actually now against the law. And interestingly, say that not too many Russian books are translated into English lately, but the only one, and somewhere on the screen, which was translated and published this year by Scholastics, it's Darius Vilke, Playing a Part. And again, it was picked up very much because it was scandal in Russia, because it talks about gay issues. It's a wonderful book, highly recommended. I would love all of you to read it and kind of get taste to the Russian literature, contemporary Russian literature. But that's very important that the books for young readers, we actually see the birth of YA literature in Russia, which never actually existed. And the translations really help because all these writers see what was done in other countries. They're able to read books in Russian, which are originally Swedish, French, English, Polish, whatnot, and of course Americans as well. We even have the first series for children, which is very rare case in Russia. Like maybe for very small children, now we have this Little Big Girl series, which is like 10 books about this huge giant girl who's lived with her normal parents in a normal city and just trying to make normal friends, and trying to make her life normal. And that's another. And another topic which came lately a lot, it's a kind of memoirs for children, memories of the childhood of various periods, sometimes a childhood of the writer and sometimes somebody else's childhood. And it's very serious books, and in a way, Breaking Stalin's Nose, and I'm very proud of it, broke the seal on memoirs in Russia, because it was written by Russian-American writers. We translated together. It was work of love, killed many, many hours, translated into Russian. It was published. It was a huge kind of hit because it was very political. Next, what we have, memoirs about exile during this, and it's real kind of story of a real girl who was sent to Gulag and after that to exile with her mother and lived there in a horrific situation, the Sugar Kid. And the memoirs of much easier time, like 60s, 70s, and 80s, but contemporary children can see what's going on actually, what was going on in the past. And I would want to ask you, Sibylla, if anything of that sort exists now in Bulgaria, kind of look into the past and in the same time providing something for young readers to think about. Or Junka, if you want to be first.
As I was listening, I was thinking about a particular situation, and in Poland, there's a generation of people today who are discovering the difficult and the relationships between the Polish people and the Jewish people, and of course the extermination camps from the Nazis were in Poland, but there's been a perhaps unspoken during the Soviet years relationship between what happened there and what it means to people today. But there's this concept that we came across in the Fulbright week that we had of study of Jewish history in Poland in Krakow, and it's this whole concept of Jewish future. And what does it mean when people find out that in fact they had been among the hidden children and that they had Jewish roots, or people who returned to Poland after the wall came down. And so this concept of Jewish future has been studied some. And in the NAMI concours, one of the winners, Ursula Pawlinska, wrote a bilingual book, a bilingual Yiddish alphabet book. Wow. And it's bilingual in Polish. And this has been the source of beginnings that I think are new for this time, that not even across Poland people have become fully aware of this movement yet.
Sibylla?
Thank you for actually taking the point, because I'm going to follow on that as well. I don't think, unfortunately, Bulgaria has gotten there. Well, one thing I should probably mention is that Bulgaria actually saved the whole of their Jewish population that was in Bulgaria during World War II. Thank you, because I wouldn't be here otherwise. And the other thing that it's not unfortunate, it's shameful. I don't think the literature for young adults speaks about gay rights. I know it's really bad in Russia. Officially in Bulgaria, it's not illegal. It's officially it's fine. But the minds of the people, even my generation or younger, are quite behind. Like I have personal arguments every time I go there, like that crazy lady that speaks up, and I think it's very important to speak about these things, even if you're surrounded by people that are different opinions. So young adult literature is, at least I don't know a lot of it. I think it's behind. I think there are translations, things that are coming from the outside, but I guess it's baby steps. It's like a natural process of, let's start with the baby books first, publish these, and then we'll get to the literature. I know people are writing. I don't think they're being published that much in Sofia.
It's interesting because Russia kind of started in reverse order. Let's write something, what's that been published, it was for, 8 up or 12 up. not for young children, because for young children we still have Lebedev, Marshak, wonderful books. We have all this sort of early Soviet books or books of the 70s, which is really difficult to beat, You're really difficult to compete with that. It's beautiful art, beautiful.
I think, coming back from your point again, is we had as well books from these years, but I think Bulgarian people, because they kind of want to move on with their
Bit tired.
yeah, so they actually would like to have new books replacing the old ones, just because of the political burden that these have.
Yeah, that's exactly true in opposite order in Russia as usual, because a lot of people, especially now in Russia, again kind of look backward and sort of seeing how wonderful Russia was, how mighty it was. We need kind of all get back, and that's what really contemporary Russian children's literature fight against, and against nationalism, against, because a lot of books now trying to not revise the history, but to see history. One of the books on the screen, the Cloud Battalion, it's one of the first books which try to retell the story of World War II differently, with the pain and gore and suffering and death, not heroic death, but just death. And again, back to Jewish issue, which always, anti-Semitism in Russia is a separate story and never been attended in any form, really, never been kind of reconciled. But what's wonderful right now, there's one memoir written in the Soviet time by the woman who was in the concentration camp in Lithuania, and she survived. It's very much Anne Frank's diary with the happy end, quote unquote, because she survived. And for a while it was published in the Soviet Union, not really well read. And right now there's new publications that will come this year with all, not just the text, but she's still alive, interview with her, interview with other people around her. And that's another thing which is now very interesting now in Russia, that a lot of books written for children are not only fiction. There's a series on sort of cultural anthropology, I was part of it. There's a series of republished old book with an explanation what actually is all about, trying to educate. And it's education not only for children, but it's for their parents as well. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you want to add, we have just a few minutes.
I would like to add just one thing, that usually whenever there is an oppression or pressure coming from the government in Russia, there is always this kind of resistance, because the creative community, people who, in particular, who do publish children's books, it's a small group of people concentrated mostly in Moscow today. Actually, the origin of children's book illustration started in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad, in the 20s, and for a while, St. Petersburg was kind of a capital of arts, but right now it is definitely Moscow, and so there is when there is a pressure coming from the top, there is certain resistance. I mean, sometimes it's more, it's passive, sometimes it's active, but there is always resistance. So they might go back to Aesop's language, which it was back in the 60s and 70s, when the writers were writing stories which the reader would decipher the hidden message which was there, and that might be that. Of course, the official propaganda probably wants books about little Vladimir Putin, how he learned to hunt,
they already exist.
or how he learned to fish, or how he learned to dive, or judo, whatever that else he learned, but there is always resistance to that. And actually, I was very pleased to find out that very good friend of mine, a Russian-born American children's book illustrator, Vladimir Radunsky, two of his books was recently translated and published in Russia by a very small but progressive publishing house. So there is hope.
Yeah, there's kind of return of immigrants that's happened with Evgeny Yelchin, who kind of returned to Russia. And you have a few minutes, ladies, if you want to add anything.
Three things I'd like to mention. One is the work of Pavel Pavlak, who happens to be right here, right now. You see he graced the cover of Bookbird in a recent issue, and his work has been very innovative and interesting because he uses so many different kinds of mediums to go with the different kinds of stories that he illustrates. The second thing I want to mention is that at BEA this year, at Book Expo America, which will be in Chicago, May 11th through 13th, the Polish IBI section is sending a delegation to give a talk about Polish children's literature at BEA.
Chicago.
In Chicago.
Very appropriate.
Yes, with our, Chicago is the second largest city of Polish residents in the world, only second to Warsaw. So that will be in May, and we hope to have some kind of USBBY presence with this IBI delegation that's coming over. And the third is that we could all go to Moscow in 2020 because IBI Congress will be in Moscow in 2020. We just got back from giving talks at the Russian Library conference there, and there's quite a group of people who are working hard at making a presence in the Russian children's library and children's literature world. So
We started from Bulgaria. Let us finish with Bulgaria.
I just want to mention a couple of names that hopefully will be remembered or maybe make it because, again, I'm representing friends and people. Kapka Kaneva, you saw her work here.
Just been on the screen a second ago.
Oh, Yana was just back. Yana Levieva, she's a very talented artist who actually teaches a lot of Chris Vrashko's books, which I bring to her all the time. Kirill Zlatkov, he did this one and actually the beautiful, they just republished and translated Daniel Harms into Bulgarian, and he did the book design, beautiful work. And Luba Khaleva, who is also a young, she was actually trained as a poster artist, which you mentioned that you saw the Polish posters, which were a big deal in Bulgaria as well. The Polish posters were really a thing in the 80s. And the last thing that I wanted to share here is I don't know if Claudia Bedricks is still here from Enchanted Lion Books, but if she's not, hopefully she'll get the message. I'm working on a project through my library which donates 2 books weekly to 2 public schools that are adjacent to the University of Pennsylvania. And we designed a book plate for them so the kids can see, oh, the university is kind of supporting us. Maybe we should go there one day. So it's a really good project. We make posters for the teachers so they know what's available and if they want to use it for their program. But the Enchanted Lion Books is like my #1 place to go for books. Like, I personally own 90.78% of their books, and 70% have made it into the list. So I'm really happy that I'm here today and got to meet everyone, and thank you.
And I think we're perfectly on time, and I want to thank you, my wonderful panel. We did it well. And thank you for wonderful audience.
Thank you.
I think we have room for one question. Anyone have a burning desire here that they want to ask a question of our panel?
I think you do.
No, I mean, I just wanted to see if anyone has anything important they want to say. There is also going to be,
Somebody
over
there.
here? Okay, yes.
One of the questions I had is you were talking about periods where...
For those of you in the back, the question is that it seems that there's a lot of influence of revolutions on the literature from these countries, and wanted to know what your opinions are.
Okay,
Well,
you can start.
Yeah, okay. I think that, as I said in the beginning, that revolution was a positive force in unleashing this amazing creative power, but then eventually it's like always with revolution, it starts killing its own children. It happened in French Revolution, it happened in Russian Revolution, it happened unfortunately in most revolutions. And then that totalitarian control creates some kind of first underground, but then more well-known resistance, like what happened with Solidarity or with Russian dissidents, and a lot of them were writers and artists, and some of them were imprisoned. Actually, in 72, I'm not remember exactly the year, there was a big outdoor exhibition in one of the park called Izmailovo Park in outskirts of Moscow, and the artist, the avant-garde artist, asked for permission. The permission was denied, but the artists came with their work and set them up at the park, but soon after the bulldozers came and the security forces dressed up as workers said that there is some kind of project going on here, and the bulldozers destroyed the artwork, artists were arrested. So this kind of things is always positive, because then from that moment the underground art become above ground, and the whole world knew about this process going on in Russia, whereas before it was really underground with just few people know that it even exists.
To add about the Polish role here, and it's very important because in the what used to be Soviet bloc, Poland always was the freest country with the most revolutionary movement, and my generation grew up on Polish movies. And for, generation of the writers now, which kind of mostly younger than me, but still they live enough years in the Soviet Union, that Polish experience for them was the window into freedom, and I think that kind of helped. And I think it's interesting because the early Soviet art affected Polish art tremendously.
Thank you.
Art in the whole world, but we got it back from many other places. We got it sort of this freedom streak from Poland back to Russia.
We can continue this conversation over coffee, and first Carolyn has a couple of very important announcements. Thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Спасибо.